And
Okay.
we just start over.
Okay, so do you want to take over, or?
Sure. All right, section 1.1, Capitalism's Instability and Unevenness. Capitalism is a notoriously unstable economic system. Times of growth oscillate, often in extreme ways, with times of decline. This has always been the case since capitalism replaced feudalism in Europe and expanded globally from there. Its oscillations take many names, from downturns, busts, deflations, contractions, recessions, and depressions, to upturns, booms, inflations, expansions, and prosperity. Professional economists have had to admit that capitalism displays endemic business cycles, but keep hoping that something might be done to prevent them, or at least to keep them from undermining the system. Many economists have built on the work of John Maynard Keynes to assert that the proper exercise...
1 second.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention, I brought this up with a teacher that I was working with at high school. Or rather, it was brought up by him that capitalism goes through times of downturns. And the way he kind of put it was kind of simplistically, but he kind of took it for granted. Like, in order for us to, and he's definitely a proponent of capitalism. He kind of thought of it as, well, in order to continue this amazing economic system that we have called capitalism, we have to undergo these growing pains, of course. And this is just part of this amazing system that we have. And he kind of just left it at that. And that was kind of eye-opening for me. I just thought I'd mention that.
Okay, yes. So how did you react?
Completely disregarding millions upon millions of people suffering.
Right, yeah. So I was going to say, I was wondering how you reacted to that internally and what you were thinking. Okay, but you answered that question appropriately.
I couldn't get past the shock.
But, I doubt that's a totally uncommon way of thinking about it.
I agree. I'm sure many people see it that way.
And I don't know what to do about that. Necessarily. Right? Like, I don't... Because, you simply pointing out that, millions upon millions of people suffering as a result of these cycles and these downturns seems insufficient to win folks over. So, I don't know. Again, I think...
that's I don't know what it's called, but that's simply the, oh gosh, I think there's a word for it, but people react much more viscerally when it's like a single person suffering, but when you say millions, it kind of dilutes the compassion. And so I think that's kind of the reason why people can't really take it too seriously as an argument against it.
Right.
But
one thing, though,
maybe they would if they were one of those people in a Hooverville.
One thing, though, is that people increasingly are experiencing the problems of these downturns themselves, right? Of course, us included, but I think even people who are relatively well off, and if not them, then certainly family or folks that they know. And so that's not promising. That sucks, and in some ways makes a lot of other things difficult, and of course, not at all ideal circumstances for humanity thriving. But it's something that Wolff has pointed out too, right? Like, he used to struggle to get crowds to attend lectures, right? And he felt like he was talking to a brick wall. But since 2010 or the crisis of 2007, 2008, there have just been people lining up in spades to hear what he has to say.
That's a good point.
There was something else that I was going to add to that. Oh, no, this is just a real tangential aside. But so the home, we talked about this when we had our hike and barbecue before the action group hike and barbecue. But the crisis of homelessness.
A raging success, by the way.
Yes. It was by our standards, I suppose. The hike and barbecue. So I had mentioned how the crisis of homelessness in California just it's unceasing. And the homeless population in California now accounts for. Do you remember what the percentage is nationwide?
I do.
What is it?
25%.
Yeah. And I try to follow this. I mean, because I'd reported or wrote a news story about it a while back for Truth Out, and I want to do a follow up at some point, as we talked about before. But I read just recently about what the folks at the LA Times had called, and I don't know if they made up the term. To be fair, it was a decent story, a decent report, but they termed it in the headline middle class homelessness, and by that they mean folks who live in vehicles, who live in maybe some cars, but primarily RVs and that sort of thing, who can't afford a home, of course, and so they park where they can and live out of their RV. And it just occurred to me, well, one, just how stark a contrast it is in California, especially because the focus there in the story was on Santa Barbara, and of course it's like a beacon of wealth and lavish indulgence in a lot of respects, but it's side by side with not an insignificant number of people, and not the stereotypical sorts of folks that when people think about homeless, like it's people who work one or more jobs, and some of those jobs are we would think worthy of. I mean, of course, all jobs are worthy of decent pay, but we would think that these people would be paid relatively well. Like there was a nursing assistant who was part of this middle class homeless contingent, and I mean, you and I both are familiar enough with the insane rental prices in California to understand how that sort of thing's possible. But I mean, it got me thinking, like, it used to be that people would aspire in the United States to a middle class existence, but now it's like we have to content ourselves with a kind of middle class homelessness, and like that's the fucking best that we can do, or like that's considered a step up from just sleeping on the street. It's really terrible, but it certainly entreats us to take something like what Wolff is writing here seriously. So anyway, I'll pick up where I left off. Go ahead.
I can just sorry to continue though. I can just hear an individual reacting to the idea of a person living out of their car but still working because they don't have enough to pay the type of rental prices that are here in California. I can hear a person hearing this and saying something like, well, move somewhere where you don't have to pay as much rent. And I hear them say this because I hear colleagues of mine give the same sort of shtick when, like, for example, I worked at a particular high school that I won't mention, but unless I already have, I don't know, hope I didn't, who are going through problems with their contracts with the districts, and people, a lot of teachers in the district are starting to get organized and forming, they're starting to be more present at the particular association that represents them.
Good for them, by the way. I want this on the record.
And one of my colleagues...
I just said good for them.
Say it again?
I said good for them. I wanted that on the record, that I was supportive of that.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, his opinion boils down to the following, which he actually said verbatim, if you're not getting paid enough, get a different job.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Is what he said. And he's a colleague of mine.
Yeah.
So he's working alongside of me, trying to become a teacher at this particular school, seeing the conditions that they're working in. And obviously, as you know, I'm sure, it's not just monetary issues. It's certain issues regarding, insurance and hours and how many students are allowed to be in the class, etc.
Right.
And my wife goes through this stuff too with her union as a nurse, where they're only allowed to, they have a contract where they're only okay to have four patients under them at a time, but then sometimes it'll get stretched and they'll get 5 and things like that. So it's obviously across many different industries. But I mean, when I heard my colleagues say this, I lit into him. First of all, I kind of went at him and started to, kind of Socrates his ass. But he
I'm so glad we're recording this.
He just kind of it wasn't really worth it because and this is a really important thing to touch on. It's not really something that he feels the need to be concerned with. It's just not something he needs to be concerned with. And I think when it comes to homelessness, that is the way a lot of people feel. It's kind of like, well, it's not happening to me. It's happening to this faceless mass that I'm only aware of when I hit very busy intersections near Walmart, etc. It's just kind of out of sight, out of mind type thing. And I just thought that since he's around teachers that are really in depth with the organization over there, the teachers organization that is representing the teachers, and for him to think this was just like, oh man, he's gonna be working at a school, and he's gonna be
unconcerned with the quality of education is what it boils down to. Right, because teachers' working conditions are students.
Exactly.
And so I'm glad he chose the right profession for himself there. But no, I mean, you're right. With the homelessness thing, I think to an extent, a lot of folks don't think it will or does or will affect them, but increasingly it will. I mean, and I think a lot of, that's the case. That's the story of a lot of folks who now find themselves in those sorts of situations. And of course, I think we both come way closer than we would have liked to ourselves, and so I mean, but not that like those who then find themselves in those situations just didn't care. A lot of people, I think, they're so focused on trying to provide for themselves or their family and really struggling to do that it's hard to think about people in those other situations. And, that's one of the reasons that various types of organizing are so important, is because they can, at least at their best, like bridge those divides. And to return to your example, I mean, I just don't know what to say about that. I mean, that's so like
the first thing I said to him was, because he said, just get a different job. And I said, I believe that was Margaret Mead who first said that when she was talking some shit like that.
That's great. Socrates in his ass, yes.
Yeah.
No, but a couple things on that. Like that was raised, I was watching a documentary actually about homelessness in California that was made a couple of years back, because it's not a new phenomenon. Obviously, you don't get to 25% of the nation's homeless population overnight. But folks were asked, like, why still try to make a living here? And that's just the thing that I guess your colleague doesn't give a shit about, is like, well, people have family in places and friends in places and social networks, and like human ties,
Exactly.
the sorts of things that allow us to be human beings. But then even more like, strictly economically speaking, so what if they go somewhere else and just like give it a shot, but it doesn't work out? And so they're just supposed to like travel across the country as like nomads, hoping that somewhere they can find a job that pays? That makes no sense.
No, the base rebuttal to his point is that he gives no consideration into what it actually means to quote unquote change jobs, or to quote unquote find a different job, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's just to his mind, it's the same as the libertarian point, which is just that, well, if you don't like it, do something else. If you don't like living in this country, move somewhere else. If you don't like the language, go somewhere else, or whatever it is. It's like, it's that easy, huh? Okay, it's very simplistic, and
you know what? This is a very important point that I've been trying to wrap my head around for a while. I mean, for lack of a better way to phrase it, I think it constitutes a particular kind of ideology, or it has ideological elements that make it so that people don't no it's like it's a disconcern with and a anti-democratic attitude toward the changing of conditions. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. I mean, it's a lot more than that too. But it's like no, why it doesn't make sense, of course, to make the wages higher here or somewhere else. Like, that's not even an option, even though it should be, right? Because that's what gives people more say over the decisions that affect them, and would make it less necessary for people to try to find another job, because eventually, and in many cases already, those other jobs pay just, similarly piss poor wages. And so it's like, and this is, we've talked about this before with other public figures that I've mentioned. It's like, the emphasis on, or that dichotomy between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. John Dewey said it best, actually, in a New Republic article when I was researching this. He asked, like, we talk so much about equality of opportunity, but opportunity for what? Like, what opportunities are there, and what should be there, and what can we do to make those and oftentimes that requires some kind of collective action, right? And so, but that inability to even conceive that is what gets me. Not that, like, people suck because they can't do that, although sometimes they take on asshole-like attitudes as a result. But it's like, what is necessary to break down that barrier, those parameters of thought, so that the idea of actually, let's organize or work to make it so that these conditions aren't so terrible, instead of saying, go do something else, exercise your freedom. Like, why not exercise your freedom here and make it, that much more expansive? Like, I don't know how to do that, though,
Yeah, neither do I.
So, I need to get, for those who are listening, for our listeners who have weathered the storm and remain with us, I am drinking a Modern Times beer, the Hoppy Dank Amber, of the Hoppy Dank Amber variety. And this is a San Diego-based, employee-owned brewery. And we had purchased some for our hike and barbecue, our tremendously successful one. And we had some left over, and so that's what I am working on right now. I'm going to get myself another one, which will just take a second. And then, Frank, did you want me to continue reading? I think I only read like a paragraph or two before we burst out.
I think you can continue, I think. If you want to grab another Hoppy Dank first.
Done and done. Okay. So there's the sound of it opening. Alright, so if we finish with the John Maynard Keynes, politicians have taken that assertion another step in the United States. Every president who presided over a cyclical downturn promised that his economic interventions, his mix of monetary and fiscal policies, would not only end that downturn, but would ensure that we would not have another in the future. No politician or set of policies in the history of capitalism, however, has yet delivered on that promise. Capitalism also develops unevenly across space, and always has. Thus, the growth of wealth in some parts of the world goes hand in hand with the growth of poverty in others. Every particular economic development path has its winners and its losers. Over the same period of time, employers often gain while, and often because, employees lose. This particular unevenness is a crucial cause of the global capitalist crisis that erupted in 2007, as I will demonstrate. Merchants and manufacturers developing in urban areas often produce simultaneous devastation in rural agricultural areas. The competitive success of one company in one town may devastate its rival companies and their towns. British capitalism's success was the root of India's crisis and decline. The explosive growth of capitalist enterprises in China finds its counterpart in devastated former manufacturing zones of the United States, much as earlier Europe's Industrial Revolution worked to undo production systems in Asia. Capitalism's disruptions have always provoked complaints from those who suffer their results. Such complaints can and often have evolved into criticisms of capitalism as a system, and from there to calls to usher in non-capitalist systems. The champions of the status quo sometimes respond with arguments that the causes of decline and underdevelopment are not the fault of capitalism, instead blaming natural conditions, for example floods and droughts, political disruptions such as wars and government intervention, or cultural patterns, inadequate entrepreneurship or savings behaviors, and so on. The most common and enduring of these defensive arguments focuses on state economic intervention as the key external cause of capitalist crisis. Thus, for nearly a century now, it has been popular to blame capitalism's instability and unevenness on government interference in free market economics. Indeed. Economists, politicians, journalists, and pundits point to taxation, government spending, and regulation of markets as the culprits. The major counter-argument, associated since the 1930s with Keynes, instead locates the root of capitalism's ups and downs in culture, how individuals cope with uncertainty about the future and their propensities to consume and save, and the ways in which culture and economy interact. Thus, Keynes and those influenced by him see government economic intervention as useful and necessary to offset and to end the destabilizing interaction between culture and economics under capitalism. Yet, since capitalism's instability and unevenness are continually reproduced across every variation of external, natural, political, and cultural conditions, some of those who defend the system have felt compelled to find better arguments that don't rely on external causes. These thinkers have sought to justify capitalism by insisting that its negative dimensions, such as cyclical downturns and inherent inequality, are simply the necessary price to be paid for economic and social progress. They claim that the game...
wow.
Yeah,
There it is.
he really anticipated all of our comments and objections. They claim that the gains of capitalism's winners are greater than the losses inevitably suffered by economic losers in the system, and therefore that instability and unevenness are ultimately, in terms of their net social effects, progressive. Capitalism is thus an efficient system, no matter how unstable and unequal. Did you have something to add to that, Frank?
Not really. There's a lot there. There's something I did want to go into a little bit earlier, but I don't think I'm going to be able to find it, though.
Okay.
We can continue.
I'll try to finish up this section then. Yet, this notion of efficiency, much beloved by those who celebrate capitalism, is actually quite elusive. To know whether an economic system is efficient requires identifying and measuring all of its effects, the positive that accrue to the winners and the negative that affect its losers. Yet this is an impossible task. The problem is quite simply that the costs and benefits of capitalism at any time are infinite in number and project long into a future we can never know in advance. Besides the unsolvable problem of identifying and measuring all of capitalism's direct and indirect effects, we face an additional and insurmountable problem. Whatever effects are identified and measured by an efficiency calculus are never the results only of capitalism as an economic system. That would be a grossly economistic or economic determinist claim. Those effects also have other causes, political, cultural, natural, too numerous to identify or measure. In short, the notion of measuring the efficiency of economic events or processes or of an economic system is a mirage. It is not possible to identify or measure all of the effects of any social factor, nor is it possible to separate and weigh all the influences that combine to produce each effect. The very concept of efficiency would have been banished from discourse, let alone science, long ago if it had not proven so ideologically useful. Efficiency discourses resemble capitalist notions of efficiency, which in turn resemble the medieval doctrines and debates concerning how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. they too will one day strike people looking back as bizarre and absurd. One particularly pervasive form of efficiency analysis, known as cost-benefit analysis, claims to compare the total of benefits to the total of costs of any economic event or project, and to then declare the system efficient if the total benefits exceed the total costs. It has become common across the history of capitalism for such calculations to serve those campaigning for nearly everything imaginable: a change in interest or tariff or tax rates, allowance to build a highway, housing development or mall in the place of a forest, regulation or deregulation of markets, and so on. Elaborate calculations of costs and benefits, suitably dressed in charts and graphs, have been key props in the efficiency theater that has provided ideological cover for the endless struggles attending capitalism's uneven development. The usual winners in these struggles not only determine what economic event, plan, project, or system will prevail and its actual development path, they also wrap that path in the ideological mantle of progress. However, capitalism's recurrent crises, and especially those that cut deep and endure for years, can and repeatedly do undermine the capitalist efficiency narratives of their times. The efficiency argument for capitalism rings hollow in the face of high and enduring unemployment affecting jobless millions and their relatives, friends, and neighbors. Watching the growing absurdity of foreclosures creating both homeless people and empty homes throws into serious question the standard defense of capitalist efficiency. Yet the tradition
of... You want me to
yeah, sure.
Unless you have something that you'd like to touch on regarding what you've read.
I'm not sure I do at this point. Okay. Did you have anything?
Well, I was just going to say it's a little tough because he touches on the idea of cost-benefit analysis, which I think is a little bit more in depth than I can definitely speak to regarding the efficacy of cost-benefit analysis, which apparently he says is not effective.
Well, not effective. Not effective specifically with respect to trying to assess capitalist efficiency or the efficiency of a particular capitalist project, I think.
Oh, okay.
Which makes some sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's a good point, even though it's maybe kind of funny because even critics like Wolff, I think, will point out how inefficient capitalism appears to be, but by his own logic, that might be reaching, because it's hard to do that. It's hard to say. It's hard to account for all of these factors, and it can become very economically deterministic, as he said, or reductionist, because you're not accounting for culture, you're not accounting for these other things. But I think it is a really solid answer to somebody who would claim, oh, look how efficient capitalism is, or look at the progress that is bestowed upon us. Because how would you measure that, right? And how would you measure that up against the costs? And you can't deny that there are some costs, but you can't. But it's impossible to quantify those and the benefits, either of those or the benefits, because there's all these other factors that we actually can't factor into our equation because they're innumerable.
Yeah. I think this is just a reflection of the sort of emphasis on short-sightedness that is placed on that capitalism is known for, as opposed to thinking long term. But anyways, I'll continue unless you have anything else to say.
No, go ahead.
Yet the tradition of efficiency arguments for capitalism has taken such a hold in our discourse that even when capitalist crises have undermined them, claims regarding efficiency have often resurfaced in the rhetoric of anti-capitalists. Socialists and communists during the Cold War often simply inverted the standard argument by insisting that it was socialism or communism that was efficient, or more efficient than capitalism, and thus represented progress. They, too, often ignored the impossibilities of identifying and measuring all costs and benefits, and of separating and evaluating each of the myriad influences that produce them. Such socialists and communists also discovered that when social forces pushed against them strongly enough, their efficiency arguments no longer made sense. people became skeptical and eventually dismissive of those systems' claims to efficiency, much as happened to capitalism in its crises. The end of the communist governments in Eastern Europe toward the end of the 20th century followed a mass loss of confidence in claims for socialism's greater efficiency compared to capitalism.
Pause just one moment.
This is starting section. Sure.
I think he's right, you know, at least in some respects, but at the same time, is he just setting this up as, you know, traditional socialism and supposed communism as failing in this regard, and that being different from what he's going to propose? Because he certainly seems to suggest that capitalism is pretty wasteful, at least contrasted with the alternative that he favors, right? Which would be a kind of cooperative economy. And, you know, and that's, you know, very much integral to his critique, is that, you know, if you had workers who owned and controlled their enterprise and the surplus that they produce, right, you wouldn't have the same sort of waste and efficiency, right? You wouldn't have corporations picking up and shipping and moving production overseas. And so it seems kind of odd that he would, you know, really hammer this home when, and maybe even, I don't know if hypocritical is too strong a word, because we'll see, we haven't read the rest of the book, but it seems odd that he would, you know, point this out, but then yet make similar arguments like those that he's criticizing.
I'm not sure. I was getting caught up in thinking of what was causing Eastern European socialism to its downfall and stuff like that. And so I was on a different.
Yeah, but that might be a crucial distinction between, say, you know, what he wants to put on one side, which is these previous forms of attempted socialism, and what he's going to propose based on his different definition of capitalism and understanding of it and critique of it. And so that might be it there. That might be like at the heart of the difference.
So we are starting section 1.2, welfare state capitalism, 1945 to the 1970s.
Do you think
and coming to the point of...
Go ahead.
What's that?
I was going to say
we're coming to the point where I'm at the end of my version that I have on my device.
Oh, you're done? You're out of text?
No, not yet, but I'm coming to it. On my version, it's page 37, and my last page is 48, so...
Okay, so maybe we can finish this section,
and these
hopefully.
Are
I'll let you read, and then if necessary, I can pick off. Okay, cool.
Okay, so, in the wake of the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II, both the U.S. and Europe turned dramatically from relatively laissez-faire to relatively state interventionist forms of capitalism. State authorities in most countries limited the powers and wealth of corporations and enhanced the wages and state supports for the mass of people. State interventionist capitalism, quote, with a human face, replaced the more laissez-faire, harsher capitalism that had built up since the late 19th century. From 1945 to the 1970s, state interventionist capitalism was the norm, with Keynesian economics its dominant theoretical frame of reference. From the early 1970s until the crisis of the U.S. economy in 2007, laissez-faire capitalism was the norm, supported by the widespread acceptance of a neoliberal ideological framework. The last half of the 20th century was thus a perfect example of the shifts within capitalism between more and less state interventionist phases. In capitalism's current crisis, an ongoing struggle concerns the pace and form of the next possible oscillation. This time, however, the possibility of a break from capitalism's repeated oscillations to an altogether other economic system, different from both basic forms of capitalism, is stronger than it has been since at least the 1930s. The extremes of wealth and poverty produced in the 50 years before 1929 generated a critical response. So too did the wrenching transformation of rural and agricultural people into an urban industrial proletariat. Organized and militant trade unionism developed, as did large and militant socialist and then communist political parties. While their development was uneven, socialist and communist organizations were large, strong, and unified enough to become an important political force as the 1929 capitalist economic crisis deepened into a broader social crisis in many countries. Thus, in the US, for example, social movements led by socialists and communists transformed a rather conventional, centrist New Democrat president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, into an active promoter of massive state interventionist capitalism. In the depths of the Great Depression, he found himself caught politically between the conservative business leaders and the de facto alliance of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, and various socialist and communist parties. That alliance demanded immediate and massive government relief for the sufferings of average Americans brought about by the Great Depression. Militants within that alliance criticized capitalism as the cause of that suffering and openly called for its replacement. Roosevelt's strategy took shape in this context. He maneuvered deftly toward his New Deal, putting in place the basis for the form of welfare state capitalism that took hold in the U.S. from 1945 into the 1970s. To the masses and the Union Leftist Alliance, he offered the following bargain. If you give up your anti-capitalist revolutionary politics, I will provide legal protections for unions, political legitimacy for leftist parties, so long as they keep to certain bounds, and mass social welfare expenditures. Chief among the latter were... Hold on, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Do you think FDR was prescient enough to be thinking in his mind at the time, I'm going to put these in place, but I know that over the next couple decades, these policies will be dismantled so that capitalism will then come back into its form it was in the 20s and 10s and stuff, or in the 20s rather.
I don't know.
Because he did run on. It was definitely a huge compromise in that he was sort of saving capitalism from itself, as opposed to, maybe a general idea of, he brought on socialist ideas and, we turned socialist for those 20, 30, 40 years or whatever. It was more of like I think Wolff is, it's kind of an awesome way that he's putting it. So again, I'm going to quote here. To the masses and to the left in general, he offered the following bargain: if you give up your revolutionary politics and rhetoric, I will provide legal protections for unions, political legitimacy for leftist parties, and mass social welfare expenditures. So he promises to do these things, but I wonder if he knew that sometime in the deep future, and I mean not even that too deep a future, that it would be slowly dismantled, because these are almost like stopgap. They're just like super slow motion stopgap procedures.
They are, but they had and in many circles continued to have a lot of public support, and I'm not so sure that all of his administration was, say, opposed to these sorts of things. Maybe they saw them as actually really worthwhile stopgap measures. Like, that's certainly the impression that I've got from various readings. I read Catherine Olmsted's Right Out of California, where she talks about the labor organizing in the 30s in the agricultural fields of California primarily, and the resistance from and the counter-revolution in some sense from the big agribusiness folks, and the role that FDR played, as well as your guy Upton Sinclair. And so but she also talks about some of the people from the Roosevelt administration who came in, and what their kind of positions were. And I don't think that they were necessarily antithetical to a lot of those things that FDR passed. Granted, he may not have, been able to pass them without, the big social movements pressuring him to do so, but two, he may not have cared as much, right? like him kind of being that kind of centrist moderate.
Yeah.
And so maybe he was turned into much
Exactly.
more of a progressive than he would have been, but I don't think he was like a capitalist. No, I don't want to say capitalist, because yeah, he was certainly, as like Nancy Pelosi, like we live in a capitalist system.
Exactly.
But at the same time, and like even back then, I think there's a marked difference between some of the things that you would find in an FDR speech that you'd find in a speech of major Democrats today, even though we've are the beneficiaries of some of those programs, and some of them they wouldn't challenge, but there's a lot more embrace of privatization and the free market among Democrats. There has been the last 30 years, what Wolff refers to as neoliberalism, than there was in FDR's day, because, well, one, they were dealing with a Great Depression worse than what's happened since 2008, as bad as that's been. But yeah, I mean, I guess, like, even though he was not an anti-capitalist by any stretch, like, I'm not so sure that he was thinking about how he might allow capitalists to get the upper hand again. Like, I think that he saw some.
Yeah,
I think the administration in general kind of saw some of these programs as being like pretty monumental.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I know that they saw that.
Okay.
In that way. So I'll continue.
Okay.
Unless you have something.
No.
Chief among the latter. Well, let me start a little bit. So again, if you give up your anti-capitalist revolutionary politics, I will provide legal protections for unions, political legitimacy for leftist parties, and mass social welfare expenditures. Chief among the latter were the establishment of the Social Security system, the unemployment insurance program, and the direct hiring of more than 12 million new federal employees between 1934 and 1941. To the capitalists, he offered the following deal. If you give up significant portions of your personal and corporate incomes in the form of increased federal taxes to help pay for the federal government's new social welfare spending, and if you accept the new legal protections for unions, I will provide labor peace and a left political alliance committed to reforms and collaboration with the government rather than revolution. Roosevelt warned the capitalists that failure to accept the deal he offered would mean having to cut a far less advantageous deal with the CIO Socialist Communist Alliance, then spreading quickly across the country. Roosevelt's strategy succeeded. The struggle within the alliance between revolutionaries and reformers ended with the defeat of the anti-capitalists. The coalition with Roosevelt and the Democratic Party around a reform agenda became the dominant politics of almost every section of the CIO Socialist Communist Alliance, although some maintained, with much difficulty, revolutionary attitudes and goals. The capitalists were split. The portion that supported Roosevelt in his strategy was sufficient to win Roosevelt the political support he needed to carry through his major commitments to establish welfare state capitalism. The other portion remained steadfastly opposed to his plans and immediately began massive agitation against the New Deal. When the new capitalists opposed to welfare state capitalism lost, they commenced their version of a long march to undermine and then undo the New Deal in the decades after 1945. Roosevelt's reward for crafting the broad coalition was to become the most popular president in U.S. history. He won 4 consecutive elections, prompting the Republicans to pass a law limiting all future presidents to 2 consecutive terms. He overcame the limits to his federal employment program when World War II enabled him to provide jobs to the remaining unemployed millions, either as military personnel or in private enterprises producing for the military. The war, like the New Deal, provided some immediate benefits to employers and workers alike. The cumulative traumas of depression and war from 1929 to 1945 profoundly shaped U.S. history thereafter. Welfare state capitalism commanded widespread political, ideological, and psychological commitments so vast and deep that it seemed this consensus could not be questioned, let alone overturned. However, its opponents were determined to do exactly that. On the one hand, and I can hear ominous Star Wars music in the background. On the one hand, they were deeply troubled by the growth of socialist, Marxist, and communist thinking and organizations across U.S. society. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union only deepened their concerns and fanned their paranoia. The capitalist strategy of destroying the New Deal coalition became the prevailing theme of the post-war period and served as prelude to undoing the welfare state it had achieved. The first major step was to break up the coalition by focusing attacks on the unions and the left political parties. The Taft-Hartley Act and the anti-communist witch hunts, of which McCarthyism was a part, were chief components of that first major step in the late 1940s and 1950s.
Hey, do you know?
The old political
do you know what the Taft-Hartley Act legislated?
I don't.
So, if memory serves, that's the one that outlaws, perhaps among other things, sympathy strikes or solidarity strikes among unions. And so you can't, like another union in another industry or another enterprise or whatever, can't also go on strike. So it essentially prevents all general strikes and that sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
And also I think has something to do with, I don't know if it also is what instantiated the rule that if you have a collective bargaining agreement, then you can't strike. But I don't know if for that for certain, or if that was separate, or if the fact that the development of collective bargaining agreements in general just came with that, like that you can't strike so long as that's in effect. But anyway, it certainly outlawed, I believe, the sympathy strikes, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Which was like a major blow to the union movement, actually.
I'm sure it was. It seems like something that'd be hard to enforce.
It would be, but it wouldn't be, right? Because there's a whole history of, and labor union history of the state coming in to break up strikes. And that is, speaking of things that are not taught, you hear some folks either on the right or of different political persuasions saying, oh, well, we don't hear enough about the horrors of communism. And in fact, I'm not sure that's true. Maybe it's true just recently, but not during the Cold War, at least not in the United States. That was all that was talked about. But anyway, but you don't hear anything about, growing up or in schools about the labor history and how violent it was in the United States. And not from the side of working people, although there was, some militant actions for sure that involved self-defense, but in terms of, police or the National Guard or Pinkertons coming in.
So, yeah, I should mention that, and I don't know if this goes beyond anecdotal, but
yeah,
I did myself teach, and it would have been taught if I wasn't there either way.
Yeah,
we did teach about violent labor relations in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically it's kind of unavoidable because of the Progressive Era.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Progressive Era was a huge part of our history, and I think that teaching the subject of progressivism in the Progressive Era, you kind of have to include the Pinkerton gang issue and the Pullman strike and the the rest are kind of eluding me right at this moment, but yeah.
I was going to say the Ludlow massacre and several others, but no, I didn't get.
It's go ahead.
I was just saying I didn't get that history when I was in high school, unfortunately, and maybe
I definitely got it in college.
Yeah,
or in junior college or whatever,
but not in high school.
I don't remember high school.
Okay. Okay. I wonder, though, if that's... from what you described, though, it also sounds like the teaching's much more kind of detailed in a way, which is kind of promising and impressive.
There there is. So in teaching or in some circles, there's when you're teaching a unit in school, there's a quote unquote enduring understanding that you're supposed to. There's these enduring understandings that you're supposed to get your students to learn, and one of them in the progressive unit is violent labor relations, basically. And so
yeah,
I think it is taught, but I don't know if it's always been that way. And I haven't I haven't done second semester stuff yet, so I'm pretty sure they're gonna probably stress communist, anti-communist stuff a lot and whatnot, depending on who I'm with. But yeah, I'm not sure. I have yet to see the full gamut.
Regardless, that's interesting to know that there is some coverage of that in American history in high schools, because I certainly wasn't exposed to it, but good to know. Anyway.
Okay, so continue on. An old political coalition was reformed among capitalists, the Republican Party leadership, and various conservative religious, racist, regional, media, and patriotic organizations. This new right-wing coalition led the way to ending the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union as a key means to breaking up the New Deal coalition and thereby undoing the New Deal's achievements. The new right did not always win. It suffered some divisions and splits in the face of the African-American civil rights movement and the feminist movement. It also faced a broad cultural and political counterattack during the 1960s. Changing family conditions, attitudes, and sexual mores have repeatedly produced other splits. Yet the new right found a substantial glue to hold itself together in a revival of the peculiar American tendency to demonize government as the ultimate cause of all social evils, by insisting that the cure for those evils requires only the removal or elimination of government's intrusions on individual freedom. Various factions of the new right could agree on attacking the government.
Pause for just one moment there.
Capitalists.
Pause for just one moment.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to kind of refer back to what we had mentioned before, I think that peculiar American tendency, as Wolff puts it, to demonize the government, which is, part and parcel of the libertarian sentiments, I think that speaks to an anarchistic element of American society, which could be quite liberatory. And that is like an opposition to government as it is manifest through the state apparatus, which isn't all that democratic. And so I think that's the basis for a lot of people like Ralph Nader's proposal for the building of coalitions among progressives and anti-capitalists with the libertarians, is that there is some shared common ground. But anyway.
I see. All right. For capitalists, this worked beautifully. They found they could focus animosity on the welfare state bequeathed by the New Deal to post-war generations. This strategy involved demonizing unionists, socialists, communists, and a vast array of liberal reformers as undifferentiated proponents of state power, government intervention, bureaucracy, social engineering, and oppression. Each component of the New Right coalition found a way to define its goals in terms of opposing one state policy or another that it claimed was to blame for the particular problem it addressed. After 1945, however, capitalists were generally much more successful than other members of the New Right coalition in achieving their goals. They were increasingly able to evade, weaken, or repeal New Deal laws and regulations. From 1945 to the 1970s, the rightist attacks took their tolls. The rightist coalition grew, winning more adherents, especially among business and upper-income groups, in response to such victories as the Taft-Hartley restrictions on labor unions and the shift in the burden of federal taxation from corporations to individuals and from upper-income individuals to middle-income groups. Meanwhile, defeats of the Democratic Party and defections, especially in the South, left many Democrats unwilling to defend New Deal programs. Tensions between the centrist and progressive wings of the party hardened into conflicts and splits. The new left that arose in the 1960s was deeply critical of the Democrats' as well as the Republicans.
Hey, real quickly on that. Real quickly on that. I was curious, how much have you seen or studied of the protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago?
None.
No. Okay. Okay. It was. Some people point to it as a real major turning point in U.S. history because it was one point in time where the media attended to it to a degree and showed the massive police violence and beating of protesters. Nevertheless, I think some 50+% of the population of the American population, according to some polls, still agreed with the way the protests were handled. But a good chunk of the American population also, saw, perhaps for the first time on television, what their state was doing. And this was, of course, while the war was still raging.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can check, like, I'm sure there's on YouTube and plenty of other documentaries, the images of police just, it's common now, so maybe it's like we don't even recognize it as being odd, but police just beating the crap out of protesters who, in many cases, weren't even, trying to initiate conflict.
I'm definitely unaware of that. I've been super engrossed in colonial times to the progressive era.
Oh, right.
I still need to get.
That reminds me. In my social theory class, when I was working on the PhD, we had this discussion, or the professor had raised it, about actually American history, so it might be up your alley. And the question is, like, why don't more history programs in high school talk about the Vietnam era? And one of the reasons being, of course, because it's so contentious, and at least up until recently, so many people had direct connections, like whether it was parents who were, like, fathers who fought in Vietnam, or, uncles or brothers or whatever, and that being, like, a very difficult subject that a lot of history programs just opted to erase or not get into in high schools.
I see.
Do you guys cover Vietnam, or is there plans to?
Well, it's on the plan to do so, but one reason might be, and I've heard this mentioned, is that they don't get to it.
Yeah.
There's such, like, oh my god, and I'm sure you can imagine there's, like, so much history to go through that, like, you're bound to offend someone through omission on some topic or another. And so a lot of times, I remember, and this is in college, so it's not totally the same, but I remember U.S. history in college. My teacher, who's a friend of mine now, he couldn't, I don't think he even got to the 60s. And this was, 10 years ago or so, but he didn't even get to the 60s. And, that it's a pity because, it's obviously a very
pivotal
transformative time
epoch.
So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, pivotal.
Huh.
So that's one,
yeah,
mundane reason.
As an instructor, a professor, I can very much sympathize with, trying to cover all the material that you want to cover and not getting to all of it. But at the same time, you're right. Like, it is really too bad that you don't get to maybe some of the most important events that have changed people's lives into the present,
Yeah. That might be one of the underlying reasons why I've only heard of this happening in one place from my brother-in-law, who is a current high school student in San Marcos High School, where his U.S. history class is taught in themes as opposed to chronology.
Huh.
And so I think one of the theme he's in right now is, like, immigration. And so I'm willing to bet within each theme it's taught chronologically, but you go through, like, immigration, and then I don't know what the other ones are. Maybe one is like on war or something, but it's like thematic as opposed to chronological. So
Yeah.
that's kind of one way that you can kind of stretch through the entire history, although you're only hitting on one theme. I don't know. I haven't seen it in practice. Maybe it's nice, but that's one thing that teachers are doing, I think.
Yeah,
So,
that's interesting.
I'll
to
continue
learn.
here. I've got a couple more pages here if you think we should keep going.
Yeah, let's finish this section.
All right. Tensions between the centrist and progressive wings of the party hardened into conflicts and splits. The new left that arose in the 60s was deeply critical of the Democrats as well as the Republicans. The leftist surge of the late 1960s marked a major milestone in the demise of the New Deal legacy. On the other hand, it represented the protest, especially of younger Americans, against the long ideological and practical decline of that legacy. On the other hand, the right's reaction to the 1960s resurgence of struggles culminated in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, a key indicator of shrinking working-class support for a Democratic Party that had proven itself incapable of inspiring much hope because it could not even protect, let alone advance, New Deal gains. Reagan's election also represented the right's renewed confidence and its determination to govern the next phase of U.S. history. That's an ironic verb to use, govern.
Oh.
Saying that they're
Yeah.
against government. Anyways, the right-wing coalition's agenda largely dominated U.S. politics from the late 1970s to the beginning of the 2007 recession. The Republican Party led the way, and the dominant center of the Democratic Party followed, if less harshly and more slowly. Thus, the more progressive wing of the party, with its labor union, African American, student, and social movement allies, became increasingly isolated and ineffective. The Democrats compromised on civil rights and liberties, sharpened already existing anti-Soviet and anti-communist foreign policies, and embraced neoliberal economic policies.
God. Yeah.
Much of the New Deal was systematically undone. Capitalism's previous swing in the wake of the Great Depression toward the hegemony of Keynesian economics, welfare statism, and social democracy gave way with Reagan's election to a rapid, sustained swing in the opposite direction. Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher rode this shift in capitalism back toward a relatively more laissez-faire Anglo-American version of capitalism that came to acquire the name neoliberalism. U.S. and UK political leaders effectively reversed the post-1929 movement toward the more state interventionist social democratic capitalism championed by the major continental European economies. Much as the Democratic Party in the United States hesitantly followed the Republican Party's rightward lurches, so European social democracy moved slowly in the direction of the US-UK model of capitalism. In both cases, the shifts continued even when loud rhetoric proclaimed otherwise. In much of the rest of the world, too, similar shifts were also underway. These political developments coincided with surges in economic growth, profits as a percentage of national income, employers' overall profitability, and income and wealth gains disproportionately appropriated by upper income groups. Much as the processes...
No, I love the way that he worded that. Sometimes his word choice, it's very academic, I suppose. Income and wealth gains
Yeah,
disproportionately appropriated by upper income groups, meaning the rich got a lot richer.
That's the economist in him.
Yes.
Much as the processes of laissez-faire capitalism had led to the crisis of 1929, so the processes of welfare state capitalism built to its crisis in the 1970s. Did I read that right? That sounded wrong. Much as the processes of laissez-faire capitalism had led to the crisis of 1929, so the processes of welfare state capitalism built to its crisis in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that ends the section 1.2.
Right.
Is that the place you want to stop at?
We could. Did you have any thoughts on what you just read?
Not really. I think this entire section was kind of historical.
Yeah, well, I mean,
happened.
no, that's worth really emphasizing, right? He's taking a very historical approach, which is not, I mean, that is very Marxian of him to do. And I appreciate it in a lot of ways, and I think it's probably very educational for those who read it. Although, I mean, for us, it's not anything, but I wonder if, the person who might who would maybe pick this up at a bookstore, if they'd find it overly academic. But I mean, sometimes that's unavoidable, and sometimes history is,
Yeah, exactly.
that kind of subject where it becomes difficult to describe in ways that aren't considered academic. But anyway, I think he does a very good job, actually, of not, because he's not just providing, of course, then an economic explanation. He's providing an historical and economic explanation of the crisis of capitalism, which is helpful because
which is, I think, easy to do. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
and it's very easy.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's like,
yeah,
you can certainly easily look back and go, hey, the last 40 years, and I think Bernie Sanders really drove this home in his campaign, talking about the shifts in the economy from the 70s and onward, and kind of he explicitly mentioned the disintegration of the New Deal policies, culminating in the what is that major Glass-Steagall?
The repeal of Glass-Steagall under the Clinton administration.
Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, which had previously
Bernie Sanders really drove that home too.
It had previously separated the commercial banks from the investment banks.
Yeah.
Which was a New Deal era policy, and the Clinton administration, much to Wall Street's pleasure, had been behind the dismantling of that, which actually, interestingly enough, couldn't happen under the Reagan administration. Had to wait until Clinton, who also passed, several series of policies that the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as the ending of welfare as we know it, which impacted millions of children, and
which is a great example of Wolff talking about how the Democrats kind of started separating themselves from New Deal policies.
Yeah, I mean, if there was ever a presidency that epitomized it, it was Clinton's. And ironically enough, like, he, ran under and campaigned under and was celebrated under this banner of progressivism. But it was like a marketized, modernized progressivism that wasn't all that progressive for much of the population, it turned out. And also was behind a lot of the additional draconian law enforcement policies too, and increase,
because of all those what did you call them?
super predators.
Super predators. That's right.
Yeah, that's
they were
really
dealing
gross.
With super predators back then. We don't understand.
Yes. No, but I mean, here's that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it does illustrate how the rhetoric has, and the understandings of people have changed. And like, now that's not, I don't want to say acceptable, but now we're like, that raises some eyebrows. We're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem like the appropriate way to address a social problem, and that's a good thing that many people now think differently. Yeah. But the next section, which we'll get to next time, does actually cover that period that we're discussing between the 1970s and 2007.
Oh, okay.
And so that'll be interesting to get.
Maybe by the time we continue, I'll be able to find the version that I purchased here somewhere in the Google sphere.
Yeah, a warning to all our listeners: the Google books sometimes can be confounding.
Yeah, exactly. That was really I enjoyed this reading that we did.
Yes, and hopefully we will finish chapter 1 in a timely fashion sometime soon, and the recordings will be shared or posted. So for those who are listening now, don't fret, because the rest of the chapter is forthcoming. We only have let's see. We have section 1.3 to get through, and then we have section 1.4, and I believe then we have a final untitled sort of couple paragraph section, and then that brings us to chapter 2. So, a couple pages to get through, and we'll try to tackle that next time. Any final thoughts you have, Frank?
So if you've listened enough to Wolff's recordings, even if you're just listening to Economic Update, he touches on all these things pretty continually. And so a lot of the things that he's speaking of in this book are things that he speaks about in his economic updates and in his other general lectures. So I think it's important for readers to know that, or for listeners to know that, and readers. And so, yeah, he really drives these things home in different ways across his different platforms and stuff.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out the economic update, which is posted regularly online for you to check out. You can go to RD Wolff. Is it rdwolff.com? And or democracyatwork.info.
Yeah.
And you can check us out, the North County Democracy at Work Action Group. North County, yet we have inroads inland into the Inland Empire. So if you are in the neck of the woods there, which I am, then don't feel excluded, because we have our tentacles everywhere, as they say. And just to reiterate, I have been drinking the Hoppy Dank Amber Modern Times beer. Modern Times being to give a shout out to unfortunately not our sponsors, but certainly our friends. I've been drinking the Modern Times beer, which is based in sunny San Diego, California. Modern Times being a newly employee-owned enterprise with some tentative but promising plans to shift into employee democratic control as well, from what I understand. So stay tuned on that.
Cool.
Well, that concludes
Sounds good.
our partial reading of Chapter 1 in Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism by Richard Wolff. This has been the North County Democracy at Work Action Group, and we are signing out until next time.